I thought a seat at my uncle's table meant I finally had the power to change things from the inside. He offered me a role as a strategist for his charitable outreach, draped in silk promises and heavy, gold-leafed influence. I believed I was joining a movement of grace until the underlying rot of his ambition began to seep through the polished veneer of the Gala's marketing. I didn't realize that by taking his seat, I was becoming his perfect shield. The heavy scent of lilies and expensive wax hung in the air of my uncle's study, a suffocating sweetness that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains. Silas sat behind a mahogany desk that looked like it belonged in a museum, swirling a glass of amber bourbon while he studied me. It had been exactly 6 months since Mom's funeral. 6 months of him suddenly appearing with silk-wrapped bouquets and invitations to galas I didn't want to attend. "You have your mother's eyes for the work, Kalima," he said, his voice a smooth, low cello note that made my skin prickle. He pushed a thick, cream-colored folder across the polished wood toward me. "I don't just want you at these events as a guest, I want your expertise." I hesitated, my fingers grazing the embossed gold logo of his firm. "You want me to be a consultant?" I asked, searching for any hint of a joke in his steady gaze. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a cold intensity. "I want you to have influence from within. You'll help us shape the narrative of our outreach. This contract gives you final sign-off on all gala promotional materials." The following month became a tightrope walk. At Novabloom, I perfected the art of appearing diligent while stalling for time. Reed Farrell, all slicked hair and forced charm, would breeze by my desk with his designer coffee. "How are those community reports coming?" he'd ask, expecting reassurance. "Just finalizing verification with our local partners," I'd reply, sliding a largely empty folder across the surface. "Ensuring the narrative is accurate." He'd nod, satisfied by the illusion of my thoroughness, and move on to more pressing matters, smoothing Silas's image. But the real work began when I left the sterile glass tower behind. I started spending evenings in the neighborhoods Novabloom pretended to serve, places where chipped paint clung to brick facades and the air hummed with a weary resilience. It was at a struggling community center, tucked between a mechanic's shop and an abandoned textile mill, that I met Priya Mensa. The building seemed to shrink under the weight of its own deferred maintenance, but inside, it pulsed with life. I'd reached out after seeing her name repeatedly flagged in internal reports regarding loan defaults. "Ms. Kaur?" she asked when I introduced myself, her eyes assessing me over a chipped formica table. Her grip was surprisingly firm despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "I received your email. You work with Novabloom?" "I'm a consultant," I said carefully. She didn't offer me coffee, but slid a stack of papers toward me instead. They weren't press releases or marketing materials. They were internal Novabloom memos, documents detailing the targeting of small businesses with predatory bridge loans. "They came in promising solutions," Priya explained, her voice roughened by years of advocating for her community. "Said these loans would keep us afloat until the city invested more in revitalization. They knew we were desperate." She tapped a highlighted section on one memo. "Look at this language, acceptable risk parameters." That's code for knowing exactly how many of us they needed to fail. I pulled out my digital recorder, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. It wasn't enough to read the dry facts, I needed her story. "Tell me what it looks like from here," I prompted. She spoke for hours, describing not just financial hardship, but broken trust and fractured community bonds. She wasn't a statistic on a spreadsheet. She was a woman fighting to keep her neighbors from being swallowed whole. As I listened, the predatory lending felt less like a business strategy and more like deliberate cruelty. I was building a dossier, not just with numbers, but with names and faces, with the raw weight of human cost. And with each story, my resolve hardened. Silas needed to be exposed, not reasoned with. 3 weeks later, the invitations arrived. They weren't just pieces of paper. They were heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold leaf edges that felt substantial in my hands. "The Philanthropist of the Year," the headlines screamed in elegant calligraphy. The gala was set to be Nova Bloom's crowning moment, a massive, televised celebration where Silas intended to cement his legacy as a savior of the underserved. I sat on my sofa with the card on my lap, the silence of my apartment feeling heavy. I knew what this was, the ultimate trap for their public image. If he could just get one night of high society approval, the predatory lending would be rebranded as pioneering progress forever. I couldn't just let it happen. I grabbed my contract from my desk, the thick binder Silas had shoved at me in 2018. I tore through the pages, searching for anything he couldn't overrule. I found it buried within the section on collateral and promotional content. A small clause granting me final editorial oversight on all multimedia materials used in public-facing presentations. It was a lifeline, a technical loophole Silas had included as a legal safety net to ensure compliance with state regulations, never imagining that his loyal niece would weaponize it against him. But accessing the server where the gala footage resided felt impossible. Nova Bloom's IT security was notoriously tight, layers of firewalls and biometric locks. Unless, during my initial weeks at Nova Bloom, before I knew what I was truly up against, I'd casually chatted with Ben Carter, a young systems administrator resentful of Reed Farrell's constant micromanaging. He'd let slip about an outdated diagnostic port left active on the main server as a failsafe, a relic from an earlier security protocol that hadn't been fully purged. It was meant for emergency maintenance only, requiring physical access to a rarely used utility closet and a specific sequence of keystrokes. A long shot, but it was all I had. 2 days later, I walked into Silas's office. It smelled of expensive leather and espresso. He was standing by the window, looking over the city. "The marketing reel is nearly finished, Halima," he said, not turning around. "Reed has produced a stunning montage of success stories. Going to be the centerpiece of the gala's opening." I pulled the contract from my bag and laid it on his mahogany desk. "I've been reviewing our agreement regarding final oversight. The wording is very specific, Silas. I have the final say on what goes on those screens." He turned then, his brow furrowed. "It's just a highlight reel, Halima. We don't need to overcomplicate it." "The current cut is fiction," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "You're showing people who thrived under your loans. I want the real stories. I want the footage of the neighbors forced out because they couldn't meet the terms." Silas stepped toward me, his face hardening. "That's not a story, that's a logistical nuance. You aren't here to be a martyr for some local grievances. You're here to help me build something lasting." "Then let the truth be part of what's lasting," I countered. He grabbed the contract, his eyes scanning the clause. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The clock on the wall ticked, a sharp, metallic sound in the quiet room. "You're trying to sabotage the gala's theme," he hissed. "If you swap that footage for something gritty, it ruins the narrative." "No," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "It doesn't ruin your narrative. It replaces your lie with the truth." He glared at me, a look of genuine fury crossing his face. He didn't realize yet that I wasn't just arguing over footage anymore. I was preparing for war. The gala was less than a week away, and if Ben could provide access to the server room that night, this whole plan might actually work. That same night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with a laptop and a heavy glass of scotch, watching the digital files pulse on my screen. I had swapped out Silas's glossy, high-definition marketing reel for the raw footage I'd gathered from Priya. The grainy, handheld video of families sobbing over eviction notices and local business owners explaining how Nova Bloom's investment had bled them dry. It was a desperate gamble. Reed Farrell, the head of marketing, had confirmed that the system would autoplay the centerpiece on the massive LED screens at 8 sharp. I knew if I didn't do this now, the lie would become the official history. The morning of the gala arrived with suffocating humidity. As I stood in the foyer of the Grand Hyatt, my hands shaking inside the silk folds of my dress, a knot of nausea tightened in my throat. The lobby smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax, a cloying sweetness that felt like a warning. Then, I saw him. Silas was stalking toward me, his face a mask of controlled fury. He hadn't even made it 10 feet before he locked onto my position. "What did you do?" He hissed, grabbing my arm just enough to make me wince. "I checked the server logs this morning. The file you uploaded, it's not the montage. It's what we discussed, Silas," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady as guests began to flood into the ballroom. "The truth. You sabotaged us. That's a breach of contract, deliberate sabotage." He was shouting now, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "I'll have you sued into the ground before the first toast is finished." "Then let the truth speak for itself," I countered. He glanced toward the door and I followed his gaze to see Lorenzo Reyes weaving through the crowd. It wasn't a surprise, not exactly. Weeks ago, after months of cryptic emails and secure messaging, I'd anonymously fed him everything. The loan agreements, the internal memos, the data Priya had helped me compile. He'd promised to hold off on publishing until after the gala, understanding my plan to expose Silas from within. Seeing him here, camera in hand, felt like a lifeline thrown across a turbulent sea. He offered a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that he was ready. The lights dimmed. The crowd hushed. A haunting, discordant violin track began to play as the massive screens flickered to life. Instead of the smiling faces and polished success stories Silas expected, Priya's face filled them, her expression raw and resolute. Her voice, amplified through the high-end sound system, wasn't a prepared testimonial, it was a defiant declaration. "We aren't success stories. We are casualties of a debt trap." The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the clinking of silverware stop instantly. People in the front rows recoiled, their faces twisting into masks of shock and disbelief. Silas stood frozen on stage, his mouth agape, looking like a man witnessing the collapse of his carefully constructed empire. Beside him, Reed frantically tapped at a tablet, his face paling as he realized he couldn't override the feed. In the back, I saw dozens of smartphones rise, capturing the unfolding disaster. The tragedy wasn't just happening in the ballroom, it was being live-streamed to every follower Lorenzo had secured, and beyond. Priya continued, her voice steady and unwavering as she detailed Nova Bloom's predatory practices and their devastating impact on the community. Behind her, other faces appeared on screen, families who had lost everything, business owners driven to the brink of ruin. It wasn't a slick marketing campaign. It was a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the human cost of Silas's ambition. The audience didn't wait for Silas's explanation. One by one, the heavy silk and linen began to drift toward the exits as sponsors realized their names were now irrevocably linked to a scandal erupting across every social media feed in D.C. I stood near a marble pillar, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I had done it. But as Silas turned his gaze towards me, a look of pure, predatory hatred contorting his features, I realized this wasn't just about winning a battle. I'd ignited a wildfire, and the consequences were far from over. 1 week later, the air in my apartment felt heavy, thick with stale coffee and the hum of a city that hadn't stopped moving. My phone buzzed incessantly, emails from nonprofits and community centers praising the courage I'd shown at the gala. I sat staring at the door, bracing for legal repercussions. Silas hadn't called, but the news had exploded. Nova Bloom under fire, state inquiry launched into predatory lending. They revoked his philanthropist title by Tuesday, and civil suits followed quickly. I lost my job, predictably. But then came an invitation to help a small urban renewal fund draft their mission statement. Genuine work, finally. It felt right. I'd run into Reed Farrell outside Novabloom headquarters earlier that week. He hadn't met my gaze, his usual slick charm replaced by a tight-lipped nervousness. I remembered his constant questioning during the community reports phase, not because he cared about accuracy, but to gauge how much trouble Silas was in. He'd confessed, almost under his breath, that he'd known for months what Silas was doing, that everyone had suspected it. But Reed had a mortgage, 2 kids in private school, and a carefully cultivated reputation to protect. Survival, he mumbled before hurrying away. It's just survival. It made me sick, but also clarified something. This wasn't about good versus evil. It was about power, fear, and the choices people make when their backs are against the wall. Silas exploited that fear expertly. I looked at my hands, still trembling with the memory of Silas's rage as the truth played on those screens. Was it worth losing everything? To reclaim what he stole? I thought of Priya's unwavering voice in that hall, finally heard. My office was gone, my title stripped away. But for the first time in years, just my voice felt enough. If you want to hear more stories about the cost of doing the right thing, hit follow. So, what's your verdict? Was I the asshole here, or would you have done the same? Tell me in the comments. NTA or YTA, I read everyone. This was Savage Lessons. Subscribe so you never miss the next comeuppance, and drop a comment with your verdict. Was justice served or not far enough?